Welcome. Henry doesn't have his name here. Henry C. Matthews. Maybe you know his name, but that's okay. He said he didn't want me to correct it. And this lecture is very special and seductive. The Parthenon, Olympia, and Delphi. Have many of you been to any of these places? Yay, yay. All
Almost
right.
everybody.
We'll look forward to your personal recollections when he finishes. All right, Henry, you're on. His lectures next week is the last one.
I'm going to begin by talking very briefly about the Greek gods. You have to understand something about them, and also about mythology, but we've got to get on to the architecture quickly, so I will race through this. Of course, you know that Zeus was the father of the gods. In some religions, chastity was important, but not in the Greek religion. So here are Zeus, the father of the gods, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Poseidon, god of the sea, and I show him with the temple of Poseidon, which is close to Athens. Probably many of you have been there. It's in a wonderful position, standing over the sea. And once I swam from it out to this island here and looked back at it and felt, wondered whether I would make it home again, but there are. So the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi is one of the most atmospheric places in the whole world. If you didn't believe in the Greek gods before you went there, you will when you get there. Dionysus, the god of wine and fertility, and a patron of the arts, was very important to the Greeks. German philosophers have talked about the Dionysian and the Apollonian. Apollo had to do with wisdom and music, and Dionysus with wine and fertility. Athena, the patron goddess of Athens, has an immense dignity and superiority. Asclepios was the god of healing. He learnt the art from Charon, a centaur. A centaur is one of those creatures that has a human head and the body of a horse. So he knew all about healing. Well, so those are a few gods. Let's talk a little bit about mythology. Of course, that could be an entire university course, and I'll give it a couple of minutes. Here is Atlas holding up the world. Here is Theseus slaying the Minotaur. Of course, having been to the talk on Crete and Mycenae, you're well aware of the Minotaur. And Athena is looking on while Theseus is slaying the Minotaur. The story of Jason and the Golden Fleece is one of the most wonderful stories. I wish we could spend more time on it, but there he is observing it and about to bring it home. Hercules is shown here with the skin of the Nemean lion. Hercules was given to make amends for something he had done wrong. He had to carry out 12 labors. One of the labors of Hercules was killing the Nemean lion, which had terrorized the people around Nemea for years. And he's standing there with its skin under his arm. Helios. You may have wondered what the sun does at night. He rides through the sky and comes out again in the morning. And there is Helios with his chariot. Hephaestus, the blacksmith of the gods, worked in a smithy under Mount Olympus. But I discovered when I was in Sicily that the Greek Sicilians was quite sure that he was connected with Mount Etna. Or I guess that's understandable. Well, last week we talked about the precursors of classical Greece in Olympia, in Mycenae, and on the island of Crete, and we saw the Lion Gate at Mycenae that leads into the citadel and to the Megaron up the hill. The Megaron was the throne room of a royal palace in Greece. There were several Mycenaean Megarons, one at Mycenae, one at my mind's going blank, I'll move on. One at Tiryns. Yes, here is a plan of Tiryns, which was a fascinating city not far from Mycenae, and you can see that you enter it through a narrow door and into this courtyard with a gateway across it there and here, and then you move through a formal gateway into an outer court and into an inner court, and then on the central axis you come to the Megaron. Well, it's not very hard to imagine that the Megaron is the origin of the Greek temple. If you want to build a temple to a god, you have, what form could you put it in? You don't know anything finer than the palace of a king, so you make it like the palace of a king. But you see at Tiryns, you pass through an entranceway into the Megaron, and there it was with a hearth and four columns. But to make it into something grander, just having a Megaron on its own is not quite enough. Here is a model, a clay model of a temple from about 800 BCE. 2 columns in front of it and 4 columns around the hearth are what gives it its special quality. But to add columns all around it is another step. Now the first temples were made of wood. This shows how on the tops of columns a beam joins it, and then there are the rafters coming down, and the ends of the rafters were kind of tidied up with this element here, and then between those was a flat panel, which we will discover soon became a place for sculpture. Now I'm sure you all know that there were 3 types of column. The Doric column, which is the plainest, the Ionic, this beautiful scroll-like form up here, and the Corinthian with an elaborate capital. I'll show that, how that was developed. But we will be dealing mostly with Doric temples because they were the earliest and there were more of them. The first temple of Hera at Paestum in Italy is the most complete and best preserved early Greek temple. Of course, the Greeks didn't remain just in Greece. The land around Athens was not very fertile, and they quickly found that it was important for some people, it couldn't feed the population of Athens. And so it's not surprising that the Greeks, who were a maritime people, went off and explored places where wonderful fertile soil beckoned them. So particularly in Italy and Sicily and in Anatolia, they built their settlements and built their temples. The first temple of Hera at Paestum still has its complete peristyle of columns all the way around it. But do you notice something about it that seems a little strange? Perhaps a fault in the design? The columns down the middle, you enter this temple, and there are 2 spaces separated by a row of columns in the middle that held up the center of the roof, and we'll see how that soon changed. Here are a couple of other early columns, early temples. The one on the left is the temple of Apollo at Corinth. Corinth is in the Peloponnese. It's perhaps the first place you're likely to come to if you drive into the Peloponnese. And here you see just 5 remaining columns of this temple. They seem to be a little short and fat, not the elegant columns that were to appear. And at Assos in Turkey, one of my favorite places, you can stand by the 3 remaining columns of this temple and look out across the Aegean Sea to some of the islands. But at Paestum, where this first temple of Hera stood, is a slightly later temple, about 450 BCE, a more mature example of the Doric style. Compare the proportions of the columns with those of this later temple. The one feature of these columns is that they had entasis, which is this curvature from the top to the bottom. But note how the proportions of the columns change in this one. So here is the second temple of Hera at Paestum. Hera, of course, was the wife of Zeus. And you'll notice that there's not a row of columns down. No, I don't have a plan of it. There's not a row of columns down the center. There is a central space with an aisle on either side. Here we're looking down one of the aisles, and we see these a higher tier of smaller columns supporting the roof. This is the same temple. We're looking up at the center of the front of the temple, and we'll notice that there's a great beam across here, which is called the architrave, and then these are the metopes, and between them the triglyphs, which connect with the wooden beams. Notice how the capital of the columns flares out, and then there's a transition to the beam through this square wooden block. One early temple is the temple of Hera at Olympia. Olympia, of course, is the place where the Olympic Games took place, and the games were a ritual performed to honor the gods. It wasn't just fun and exercise. It was to honor the gods. And here, a temple of Hera was built out of wood, and gradually over the years they replaced the columns. So you can see that these columns are not all the same size. As it got later, they preferred columns that were more slender. The temple of Zeus at Olympia, built in the 5th century, early in the 5th century. Of course, the numbers go backwards because 1470 BCE is before 1440 BCE. You have to sort that one out. But this was a temple of Olympia with 6 columns across the front, a magnificent facade, and it was one of the first ones to have sculpture in the pediment. So if you gazed in through the central doorway, you excuse me, you would see Zeus enthroned there. If he stood up, he would definitely bump his head on the beams. So we will move on now to the Parthenon in Athens, another Doric temple, And this diagram on the left, it's the whole slide. This diagram shows how there's a row of columns across the front, and then there's an inner row of columns, and then a great doorway. The Doric columns support the architrave, which is a beam that goes right across, and then are the triglyphs and the metopes, and finally on the west and east ends the pediment. So let's look at the Parthenon, an aerial view looking down on this amazing rock that stands up above the city of Athens. The marketplace, the Agora of Athens, was down here, and there would be a long procession going up onto the Acropolis. But it's very interesting that the temple is not in the middle. An earlier temple was in the middle of the Acropolis. But I think as we approach it, you will see why they did this. So you climb up from the Agora and come to the Propylaea, which is a gateway. And the Propylaea leads through to where the original temple, older temple was. But they chose not to put the Parthenon in the middle, because as you approach it, instead of just seeing the front of it, you see an oblique view which is much more three-dimensional. This plan also shows the second major temple here, the Erechtheion, and then there's a small one here, and the temple of Nike in this position. So we climb up, we go through the Propylaea. This little building here was a library. Here is the temple of Nike, very small compared with the Parthenon. We'll get a closer look at that later on. And then these buildings have disappeared, but the Parthenon still stands there. Another reason for not putting the Parthenon in the center is that you can see it more easily from down below because it is on the edge. The little temple of Nike stands up high above the Propylaea. And then we go up these steep steps and come to a place where you can look, you get this oblique view of the Parthenon. Something that's missing was a giant statue of Athena, which did stand on the central axis. But I believe that we can appreciate the architecture more fully when we get this oblique view of the Parthenon and see it first from this position. The Parthenon was designed by Ictinus and Callicrates. Ictinus was the main sculptor who designed the sculpture in the pediment here and in the metapies, which are the panels between the triglyphs. As you approach the temple on the axis, the public could not enter, I believe, but through the doorway they could see this magnificent figure of Athena standing there with her shield, and in her hand she has a small statue of Dionysus. So back to that oblique view, and now let's take a look at it on the central axis. The sculpture from the pediment is gone, except for just a little piece that has been replicated here. So why is the sculpture not here in Athens? It was removed by Lord Elgin, who got permission from the Turkish governor. The Turks were not remotely interested in the classical Greek gods or their temples, and so he got permission to take it to London, and he emphasized that a lot of it had fallen, but that's an exaggeration. Much remained. I think most of the sculpture in the pediment had fallen, but the metapies, the spaces between the triglyphs, were mostly there. So most of the sculpture in the pediment was smashed. This is a reconstruction of the pediment as scholars believed it was, and we can see how they had very clever ways of dealing with the fact that it's a triangular space. So in the corner we have a figure who is reclining. His feet just fit into the end of the pediment, and in the middle Zeus is waving his hand and looking magnificent. A horse rearing has his head at just the right height. It's funny that there isn't another horse lower down. And the central feature of the east pediment of the Parthenon shows Zeus enthroned and Hera, his wife, and Athena flying in the sky. Let's take a look at the columns. You remember the columns at Paestum that were considerably fatter and had and tapered much more at the top. The proportions of the columns were very carefully refined over the years, and what we see here on the Parthenon approaches perfection or reaches perfection. To emphasize the verticality of the columns, there are grooves up the face of it, which, you remember the Egyptian columns that represented bundles of reeds? maybe that spirit is still there a little bit, but the grooves running up them emphasize verticality. This is the architrave again, and then here are the triglyphs and the metopes in the space between them. This piece of sculpture in the metope has been restored. And then there are other subtleties in the design. The temples you might think would be absolutely vertical, but actually they lean inwards. Now this of course is an exaggeration just to illustrate that point. And you would expect the platform on which the temple stands to be level, but it is actually curved. And scholars believe that Ictinus and Callicrates believed that if the temples leaned very slightly and the platform on which it stands, the stylobate, was slightly curved, it would look as if it was vertical and level. I can't prove that, but it's very, very subtle. It is sometimes seems shocking to us that these paint columns and the elements of the temple were painted. Oh, the columns probably not, but the architrave, the triglyphs, the metopes, and the pediment were all painted. Does this shock you? Traces of paint show how this was done, but obviously they believed that it was more glorious if it was done in this way. Now we have to go to the British Museum to see some of what remains of the sculpture of the Parthenon. The central part is almost entirely destroyed, but the ends of two pediments are still there. The metopes represent in many figures the battles between the Lapiths and the centaurs. The Lapiths were a tribe who lived in northern Greece, and the centaurs were these creatures who were half horse with the head of a man. And this battle is supposed to represent civilization over barbarism. I think it's a little unfair to think of these poor centaurs as barbarous, but that's what was thought. And here, running all the way around, were many, many seeds of this battle. Amazing pieces of, yes.
Art history as an undergraduate, we had this brilliant lecturer, and she talked about the Parthenon battle showing actually some ambiguity in who is winning. If you look at it, the one on the left, no, but these two on the right, there's a sense of correspondence between their movements that suggest ambiguity.
Thank you. Anyone else is welcome to chip in anything they'd like to say. And you again, Susan. If we look between the capitals of the columns, you will see that all the way around the wall of the cella, the wall that contains the interior of the temple, is a continuous frieze. And here is one scene from that frieze, which probably, it's believed that this represents the Panhellenic procession, which was a procession at festivals on the Acropolis. The crowds would gather in the marketplace below, and they would climb up to the Parthenon. These ones seem to be on horses, moving rather fast, considering they're going up a steep hill with steps, but the Greeks knew best. So looking down now from the Acropolis, you see the French, you see the theatre of Dionysus. You remember I mentioned that Dionysus was connected with theatre. So here was the theatre, and the performances were there, that took place there, were religious rites. It wasn't just entertainment. They honored the gods by telling the stories about them and performing them in a dramatic way. And beyond the theatre is this new museum, which was actually designed by a French architect, intended to display the Parthenon sculpture, and it's still in London. I believe Tony Blair was willing to give it back, but it's still in London. They have replicas. So let's look at the rest of the Acropolis. Here is the second major temple, the Erechtheion, built a little after the Parthenon, and much more complex. It probably evolved over time. Part of it was built earlier, and then additions were made to it. There's a central temple-like space with a portico on one side, and then on this side a porch with these graceful figures, caryatids they're called, statues in human form in the place of columns. So this is departs from the symmetry that we've seen and gives it a rich character. The north porch of the Erechtheion is dedicated to Poseidon, commemorating the place where he struck the rock with his trident, bringing forth salt water. This was a contest between Poseidon, god of the sea, and Athena for possession of the Acropolis. And Poseidon thought he'd been very clever to strike a rock and bring forth salt water, but what good did that do anything compared with what Athena did? I think I'll move on to this one. She planted an olive tree Perhaps this was the first olive tree. I wonder if that's true. Anyway, an olive tree was far more valuable than a bit of salt water. So she won. And here we're looking up at the north porch dedicated to Poseidon. And we'll notice the columns in the Ionic order with these delicate scroll-like forms. And then here is the south porch with 6 caryatids supporting the entablature. Oh, 6 figures. Maybe they are the daughters of Kekrops, who was an early king of Athens, or maybe they are the handmaidens of Athena. Maybe you could think of some other explanation for them, but you can see how incredibly graceful they are. And you'll notice that their garments are folded in pleats that almost represents the fluting of columns, the vertical grooves standing up the columns. The temple of Nike stands above the steps up to the propylaea. It is an incredibly elegant small temple. On the base of it, not showing in this picture, is this beautiful figure of Athena Nike by Callicrates the sculptor, adjusting her sandal. And there again, this small temple, beautifully proportioned sculpture in a continuous frieze under the edge of the roof. And from the Acropolis, you can look down into the theatre of Dionysus. Dionysus, I've already pointed out, was connected with theatre. And then on another side, down here, is a late temple, the temple of Olympian Zeus, which is built of columns of the Corinthian order. So these are Corinthian columns. And what did they come from? The acanthus plant. I always used to make sure that I had an acanthus growing in my garden. And when I had a house in Greece, I planted one there. I actually had to bring it from England because I discovered that you couldn't buy an acanthus plant in the markets of Athens. So I smuggled it into Greece from my English garden, and maybe it's still there, but you can easily see how this was the inspiration of the capital. And here is the theatre of Dionysus. Now, in the short time that we have left, I'm going to take you to 2 sites that are regarded as Panhellenic at Delphi and Olympia. At Delphi we have the sanctuary of Apollo, which was also sacred to Dionysus, and it's the site of the Delphic oracle. Greeks and later Romans who had urgent questions to be answered. Should they make war? Should they marry this woman? Or should they make war on that other nation? All kinds of stories. I could spend an hour telling you these stories, but we've got to stick to architecture. But Delphi is in a magnificent position north of the Gulf of Corinth, which separates the Peloponnese from the northern part of Greece, high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. I was once on a plane from Athens to London, and I sent a message to the pilot saying, "Why haven't you mentioned that we're just passing over Mount Parnassus?" He was not amused. So over the years, many cities built treasuries at Delphi, which lined a path leading up from the gateway up towards the temple of Apollo. So here, from a Greek ceramic design, was a picture of Apollo with his bow and arrow standing in the doorway to the temple. He's not visible anymore. As you go gradually up, you notice signs of what is missing, a pedestal for a half circle of statues, and so on. We would have passed the Siphnian treasury, the best preserved and most elaborate of all the structures there. Siphnos is a tiny island. I've been there. I stopped on the way to Athens once. A small barren island, no sign of any sculpture. But they were important enough and rich enough that they could hire the finest sculptors to make this temple or this treasury. Well, cities, that's a good question. The cities in Greece who sent representatives to Delphi very often also put valuable goods in a treasury as a way of giving honor to Delphi, I suppose. These are scenes from the Trojan War. The Greeks were absolutely obsessed with the Trojan War, and these pictures somehow show Greek superiority. Here is the Athenian treasury, just below the temple, and we move on up to the temple of Apollo. A few columns still stand, and they tell us enough to see that this was a beautifully proportioned temple with rather slender columns and slightly larger spaces between them than the Parthenon. And every view we get, whether it's from below or above, with the rugged mountain landscape, accentuates the glory of this place. Up above the temple is the theater. Here are the steps leading up the theater, and now let's look down on the whole thing. You can see how it's divided into a series of segments with steps between them. And I'll remind you again that theater was a religious ritual. So when crowds hastened to Delphi. They would attend the theatre and musical performances, and they would also have games in the stadium. We're gradually moving up and looking down, and here is the stadium at Delphi in very good condition. It's an outstanding space with a view down over the whole site at Delphi. Can you imagine chariot races here? The Pythia was the woman who delivered the oracles, who sat on a tripod under the temple and gave answers. Here's the bronze charioteer at Delphi, and a couple of athletes about to race. That's Jack Schumann, Susan. And then also at Delphi is this beautiful circular temple, which was just missed by this huge rock that came tumbling down from the mountain. Stands just there. Well, I'm a bit short of time for Olympia, but I'll just get started. This is the site of Olympia. You see in the distance here the stadium, but larger and more visible are the temple of Zeus and the theatre. Because this was not just for games, it was also for religious observance. There are some beautiful spaces there. This was a courtyard with rooms around which people could stay. And here is that early temple of Hera that had the columns of different sizes, and another view of it. And not much remains standing of the temple of Zeus. The columns have all fallen. It was one of my students. I've led a couple of tours of Greece. There's a friend of ours, Joe Hockenhull. I'm just making a comparison between our civilization and the Greeks here. And this is the temple of Zeus, which I showed you before. So I suppose I don't need to linger on that. But much has been preserved from the pediment, and in the museum at Olympia you can see part of the pediment sculpture put back in place so that we can appreciate the artistic achievements of the Greeks. And here again is the origin of the Corinthian capital. There, in the reconstruction of the replacement of the surviving elements of the pediment, at the center stands Apollo, and what's going on here is that battle of the Lapiths and the centaurs, and Apollo is kind of acting as the referee in that battle. And we can make our way through this arch into the stadium. Well, I just have one more place, but I think I'll leave that for the next one. So are there any questions or comments? You usually have very good comments. Yes.
Henry, do you want to talk about Melina Mercouri's attempt to get the Elgin marbles back into Greece and get them away from the British Museum? That was active. I was living in England at the time when she was campaigning to get them back.
Melina Mercouri was, and I think she was originally an actress, and she became the Minister of Culture of Greece, and she made it central to her role as the Minister of Culture to try to persuade the British to give the sculpture back. She failed, yes. The British said, well, we saved it. It would have been destroyed if we hadn't taken care of it. Yes.
Henry, how were you able to identify these different structures? Did the architects sign them someplace, or how do you know? Yeah, how do you know which temple was dedicated to who?
Well, the Greeks left a lot of literature behind. They didn't leave everything written that we would like to know, but certainly the making of the Acropolis was documented quite well. And then there was a second question.
Yes.
Do we have any idea what technology they would have used to have raised those? I mean, I get the stacking up of the columns, but then you got the pediment and the sculpture way up high. How did they?
That's a very important question. I don't believe that any written descriptions have been discovered, but people have tried to envision how it could be done. They must have built huge wooden structures that went even up above the roof, and they could haul stones up one at a time and swing them into place. But it really boggles the mind how on earth they could do it. But it's the same sort of question. How did they build the pyramids? Where there's a will, there's a way.
I
Yes.
have two questions. One, it seems that many of these structures are sandstone, so they are porous, and the pollution, I imagine, is affecting it tremendously. So that's my one question. The other question is the sophistication, the knowledge, the technological knowledge that existed 2,500 whatever years ago is extraordinary. What happened when all of that stopped? I mean, a few hundred years into AD, it went off in different directions.
Well, that's why people talk about the Dark Age. There are scholars today who say, no, the Dark Ages were not nearly as dark as you think, but there's a big leap from building the Greek temples to building the Gothic cathedrals. That showed amazing construction closer to our time.
So what about the sandstone?
Well, actually, I think it's limestone. There are quarries. Actually, the Acropolis is built of marble. There are marble quarries up on the slopes of Mount Pentelicon, which you can see from Athens. If standing on the Acropolis, you can look across, even see some whiteness on cliffs there. Once when I was in Greece camping, we thought maybe we could go and camp in a marble quarry. Bad idea, it turned out. It was guarded by lots of wild dogs, which was very frightening. So we tried something else instead. But yes.
Henry, this is a comment, not a question. In Greece, we visited the wonderfully preserved theater at Epidaurus, and our leader demonstrated how one could stand down on the floor and talk, and we could hear it seated upstairs.
Yes, it's absolutely amazing. I have not shown the temple of Epidaurus. Oh, I did. No, I didn't. But I will next time. If you sit right up in the back row, you can hear guides love dropping pennies and things like that, and you can hear them. And I annoyed the guides by going with a group of people, and we read a scene from the Agamemnon of Aeschylus, and the guides who were clapping their hands and saying, hey, hey, felt that this was inappropriate, but it was fun to do. Yes.
Oh, it's on. I just had to get closer. Thank you. Well, a couple of things. One, when we were in Paros for quite a long time once, and on that island of Paros, there are very large marble quarries.
Yes.
And we had no information of where that marble went, but do you know any of history? Did it go to other islands? Did it go to Turkey?
I think a lot of it went to Greece.
But up in the main part of Greece, I mean, the marble structures.
Experts can tell Parian marble from Pentelic marble.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that most of the marble for the Acropolis came from Mount Pentelicon. But I think sometimes if you get a really detailed book on Greek sculpture, sometimes it will state Parian marble.
Okay, and then the other, we went down the coast of Turkey and saw all of those ruins, and the same thing happened, George. That there would be these theaters, and that somehow they worked out that geometry, made it possible to hear, and that's been emulated in amphitheaters since that time. But when they're all stone like that, the sound is just remarkable, as you point out. Right.
We'll be talking about the coast of Turkey next week.
Yes, I will. I will be showing some of those sites next week.
Oh, good.
Yeah, the last
I forgot there were two parts to the Greek. Okay, and then you go to the Roman?
No Roman.
No, I quit.
Oh, my misunderstanding. Thank you.
Well,
Henry,
yes.
I noticed in some of those columns they had a hole in the middle of the column. When they made the columns, they drive some kind of rods down through those?
Yes, they did.
Okay, what were they made out of? Bronze? Rebar.
I probably bronze. That's not something I know a lot about.
Yeah, you could see there was a hole.
Yes.
Interesting. Well,
Any other questions or comments? I especially like the comments.
Big mouth. A number of years ago, and I've forgotten the details, BBC, there was a program on BBC about restoring the Parthenon, and those workers had come from all over the Greek world, and they used different, there was no standardization of measurements, and they used different measuring systems, arms or legs or fingers or hands, and they were amazed that there was such uniformity in the columns, and I'd like to see that again because it was very interesting.
That's a very good comment. Thank you very much.
well, I think that one has to comment that these slides were taken a few years ago because nowadays it's jammed with people, and a relative of ours went there last fall, and she said she had to get a ticket for admission, for a time of admission. So it's quite different. It's nice to have these images without a whole lot of people. Yeah.
Thank you. And so there is one more next week.
Next week, the coast of Turkey.
Which
Oh,
will,
did we miss a question? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you. Here we are.
This is not a question, it's a memory.
Good.
Many years ago, my wife and I accompanied the local high school Latin club on a trip to Greece, and when we went to Olympus. And the Latin club was dominated by a group of young women who were runners, track and field runners. And when we got to Olympus, they went down onto the track, and they crouched in the starting blocks on the cinder track. The starting blocks were strips of marble. And this all occurred in the middle of winter. We had to go up to some altitude. The roads were icy. The buses had chains on them. The conditions were fierce. But this group of 8 or 10 young women went out on this historic running track. They crouched in the marble starting blocks. It literally brought tears to our eyes. It was really just a beautiful moment.
Do you want the mic? We can't hear you. We want to hear what you're saying.
well, these places are so incredibly evocative.
Yeah. Well, I was just saying that Dick, it was a story of an Olympus. The picture you showed of you getting down with some other guy and running the track in Delphi, I had done that too.
Yeah.
Exactly the same place that you were. So it's all brought back wonderful memories of trips I've taken there.
That's great.
Yeah. And I didn't know anyone else had ever gone to Paestum, and I had gone to Paestum, and I just stumbled on it. And again, it was in an era when you just walked around and did it. Same thing in Agricola in Sicily. Is it
Agrigento.
Agrigento.
I'll take you there next week.
I went there in Christmas Day, walking around there with no one else around. And now, as you say, you get tickets for everything. To go down to the basement of a church, to go up to the ceiling of the church. It's just amazing.
I was in Agrigento on Christmas Day.
Wow. Oh, we have another comment. You guys are
Just another comment. If I were Greek, of Greek ancestry, I don't know that my head would fit into this room, knowing that this is my people who created that I have genes that are so extraordinary that to this day we admire what happened thousands of years ago. But I'm not Greek.
Well, didn't someone say we are all Greeks?
Yes.
It was, I think that was in this country in the 19th century. I'll try to look it up,
Yeah.
Some distinguished person said we are all Greeks.
Yeah. Thank you.
To prove a point, but I don't remember what the point was.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.